We are going to look at Islam and this morning and its treatment of women. Many people are not aware of the attitudes that Muslims have, and the Quran in particular has toward women. How are women viewed under Islam? We're going to look at what their authorities say. That is their book, the Quran, and there's three areas where they control and govern themselves: the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sharia laws. We'll be looking at all three of those as we look at these three. Now, as Christians, we are governed strictly by the New Testament, the Old Testament helping us to understand some of the things of the New, setting forth principles. So we are governed strictly by the New Testament. So human tradition has nothing to do with determining right and wrong. The Bible determines it, and only the Bible. How are women treated under Islam? How they're viewed under Islam? How are they treated under Islam? And what is the role of a woman when related to men under Islam? What is their role to men? How is that set forth? What are Islamic sources of authority? We'll be looking at their three sources of authority for determining the answer to these questions. Let's look at what are the state of women under Islam. Do they enjoy more equality and privileges than women under pure Christianity? Now, I'm not talking about women under a perverted form of Christianity. I'm talking about Christianity as it's set forth in the New Testament. Do they enjoy more equality and privileges? One of the arguments that the Muslims make is that in the Arabian Peninsula, where Islam started, that women were treated very poorly and before Islam. And that may be true, but are they being treated as they should be treated? That's the question. So it's not a question of how were they treated before, it's a question of how are they being treated now under Islam. What is authoritative to a Muslim for answering these questions? To a Muslim, what would be the authority to determine the answers to these questions? Remember, there's three sources of authority they have. We're looking at all three of them. The first source for guidance of a Muslim is the Quran. And Quran, it's pronounced with a Q or a K. I'm not certain as which one of those is the correct pronunciation, but I see both in literature. And a K and a Q can sound almost the same anyhow. Quran, I think, is more closely as pronounced. The second source of guidance for the Muslim is the Sunnah, which is the path, the true path of the way of the Prophet. And how do we know the true path of the way of the Prophet? Well, there were writers that wrote, some of them 100 years after he died, telling us what he did. Okay. Well, I want to ask you a question. 100 years after Robert E. Lee died, how many of you know what he did? Well, we have historical recordings, but do we have accuracy? How accurate are we? George Washington, we go back to him. And some of the writings of the Hadiths are 200 years after he died. So we're close to looking back at George Washington, and did he cut down a cherry tree and so forth and all that? Did that really happen? Stuff like that. Did he throw a silver dollar across the Potomac River and stuff like that? Well, that's kind of foolishness because probably you can't throw one across the Potomac River, particularly where he was. Now, he might have been up the headwaters of the Potomac, but not. It's too wide to throw it across. But I'm saying here, we can't be certain of something because remember, Islam said the last prophet was Muhammad, so the guys that wrote the Hadith were not prophets. They didn't have God's guidance. And so we in the church agree that the New Testament was written by the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So that the writers of the New Testament were guided by God in what they wrote. But we agree now that miracles ceased in the first century, sometime in the first century, that is, miraculous guidance of men. And therefore, we can't have anybody writing by miraculous guidance since that time. So we don't take, the Lord's church that is, doesn't take the traditions that were written 200 years after the death of the last apostle, that we don't take that as authoritative. Now we may read it and study it and listen to their arguments and see what they said and look for an argument or a line of reasoning as they're going back to the scriptures. But we take only the New Testament as our authority. We don't take traditions of men written after that time. That's very important. But they do, of course. But they admit that the Hadith was not written by the direction of Allah. That is, they weren't miraculously guided. The third source of guidance for the Muslim is Sharia. It's a code of law based upon religious principles, their interpretation of both the Quran and the Hadith. And so they look at these principles, and they try to develop principles from it to answer questions for them. And so this is what they do. They take things that were written about him. They say, well, he was a perfect guide for us, so we're going to look at him and what he did. That's a vast source of authority, and they look at that for how they deal with various questions, right? And Sharia. Modern Sharia is quite different from earlier Sharia. Keep that in mind. That's a historical fact admitted by even Muslims. Seems to be quite flexible. Sharia is. It's almost like situation ethics, which we'll not spend time looking at. It will be different for each country. And so they're supposedly interpreting the Quran and the Hadith, and then each country has their own set of Sharia laws. They're all different. You'd think if it was guided by Allah and guided by God, and they claim Allah is God, and we'll deal with that tonight in our lesson. But what we have here is, it should not be different, but it is in different countries. So-called fundamentalist of Afghanistan, the fundamentalist is one who goes back to the fundamentals of Islam. That is, he goes back to the Hadith and the Quran. That fundamentalist then takes an interpretation of them, and all this interpretation came out of Pakistan and what is now in the northwestern part of India. And they began to influence a couple of hundred years ago, began to influence Muslims to return back to fundamental Islam. But that's a historical matter. So Afghanistan are quite rigid, and other states may be quite liberal. There's a struggle between various groups of Muslims and what should be in Sharia. They're struggling over this right now. This is a problem for them. Right? Things that are required of all Muslims, let's look at them quickly. There are things that are encouraged of all Muslims. There are things that are permissible for all Muslims. And there are things that are discouraged for all Muslims. And there are things that are prohibited or forbidden for all Muslims. So they classified into these 5 categories. Things that are required, things that are encouraged, things that are permissible, things that are discouraged, and then things that are considered to be prohibited or forbidden. So they put it into 5 categories. Sharia is put into 5 categories generally, most Sharia laws. Now, let's look at what the Quran teaches about the role of women, or the nature of women, and what does the Hadith teach? These are the writings where they told what Muslims did, and particularly what Muhammad did in particular. And then let's see what Sharia teaches on the role of women in society. Let's go to their main source. That will be the Quran. Quran is not a very long book, but it's written in Arabic, of course. And the translation into English by Yusuf Ali is in Surah, which is like a chapter, 43:18. It says, is then one brought up among trinkets, talk about women, and unable to get a clear account in the dispute to be associated with Allah. So now this is the point that he's making about women. Now, a woman, it took 2 women to equal 1 man's testimony in a court. Okay? They're explaining why here. Because they're brought up among trinkets and unable to give a clear account in a dispute. And that's their view. That's the view of a woman's testimony under Islam. That's what the Quran says. Now, I don't believe that's right, but that's what the Quran says. Right? Quran has a low view of the abilities of women here. Okay? They're brought up among trinkets and unable to give a clear account in a dispute. That's a woman's how the woman is viewed. The Quran required 2 women as witnesses to equal the testimony of 1 man. And Yusuf Ali's translation, Surah 282, he says, "O ye who believe, when you deal with each other in transactions involving future obligations in a fixed period of time, reduce them to writing. Let a scribe write down faithfully as between the parties." So make a contract. Make a contract, basically what he's saying. So here he says, "Let not the scribe refuse to write, as Allah hath taught him, so let him write. Let him that incurs the liability dictate, let him fear his Lord Allah, and not diminish aught of what he owes." So keep your contracts. That's a good law. Keep your contracts. All right? Continues on. If a party, and it should be the party, liable, is mentally deficient or weak or unable himself to dictate, let his guardian dictate faithfully, and so get 2 witnesses. Two witnesses. Well, the Bible requires 2 or 3 witnesses. That's a good principle too. I would agree with this. But watch what they say. Out of your own men. And if there be not 2 men, then a man and 2 women. Okay. It takes 2 men, but it takes a man and 2 women to be a legitimate witness. See? So it's got to take 2 women to equal 1 man's witness testimony. So if one of them errs, the other one can remind her. So if you look at this now, so if one of them errs, one of the women errs, the other one can remind her. Okay? The other one can remind her. Right? That's what it's saying. The witnesses shall not refuse when they are called on for evidence. So right here, it takes 2 women to equal 1 man in a court of law or in a testimony or as witness for anything. That's a very important principle because it shows that they don't think women are smart or as observant or as reliable as men. Consequently, we see the basic attitude that's set forth in the Quran of women in general, right here in this passage. Disdain not to reduce to writing your contract for a future period, whether it be small or big. It is juster in the sight of Allah, more suitable as evidence, and more convenient to prevent doubts among yourselves. But if it be a transaction where you carry out on the spot among yourselves, there is no blame in you if you reduce it not to writing. So you can have an oral contract. But take witnesses wherever you make a commercial contract, and let neither scribe nor witness suffer harm. If you do such harm, it will be wickedness in you. So fear Allah, for it is good that teaches you. Now, and Allah is well acquainted with all things. If you are on a journey and cannot find a scribe, a pledge with possession may serve the purpose. And if one of you deposits a thing on trust with another, let the trustee faithfully discharge his trust. Let him fear his Lord, conceal not evidence. For whosoever conceals it, his heart is tainted with sin, and Allah knows all that you do. All right? Now, this is their rules of contract. And some of them are good rules. I would agree with it. But we're looking at how it views women. It takes 2 women equal 1 man in a contract as witnesses. That's the same thing in a court of law, too. Okay? Men are in charge of women in Surah 4:34. Because Allah hath made the one of them to excel the other. Right here. Now, the Bible doesn't teach men are better than women. It teaches that women are to be in subjection, but not better, not excelling. And because they spend of their property for the sport of women. So good women are the obedient, guarding in secret that which Allah hath granted. And as for those with whom you fear rebellion, admonish them and banish them to beds apart and scourge them. So a Muslim man can beat his wife, and it's just perfectly all right. That's the Quran. That's what it says. And you can look at other translations of it, and they'll translate it a little bit differently, but beat them or scourge them. Then if they obey you, I have 3 different translations. Seek not away against them. Lo, Allah is ever high, exalted, great. So after you beat them, if they obey you, then take them back. It's okay. Beat them into subjection. That's what the Quran teaches. Right? Yusuf Ali's translation says, men are the protectors and maintainers of women because Allah hath given the one more. And here in the parentheses is the interpretation of more strength. Right? And so what he puts in the parentheses is the interpretation of it than the other. And because they support them with their means, therefore the righteous women, this is the same passage, are devotedly obedient and guard in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. In other words, probably being faithful, maritally faithful, which the Bible requires too. As to those women on whom part you fear disloyalty and ill conduct, admonish them, and he put first, next, and he added that in, refuse to share their beds, and last, beat them, and then he added lightly. So the other translation said scourge them, the other one said beat them lightly, and he added lightly to it. But if they return to obedience, seek not against them means of annoyance, for Allah is most great, most high, great above you all. Now, different translation of it, but it still has beating. Shakir's translation, we want to see it. This is the third translation I have. Men are the maintainers of women because Allah hath made some of them to excel others, and because they spend out of their property. The good women are therefore obedient, guarding the unseen as Allah hath guarded. And as to those whose part you fear desertion, admonish them and leave them alone in the sleeping place and beat them. Then if they obey you, do not seek a way against them. Surely Allah is high, great. My point is, three different translations translated it. One of them tries to soften it with his own remarks lightly. But right here, one of them said, translated scourge them. So right here, it tells you that it is indeed within the rights of a Muslim man to beat his wife. And so that's taught in Islam. That is taught by the Quran. That's something that a lot of people don't realize. Now, why are we seeing this? We are seeing a multiplication, a rapid multiplication of Muslims in the United States. And so we're going to have to deal with it. And Christianity needs to fight against it because Islam is not a true religion of God. Quran gives husbands the right to demand and receive sex from their wives. Your wives are a tilt unto you. That's a plowed field. We'll give proof of that definition out of the Webster Dictionary. So approach your tilt when or how you will. But do some good act for your soul beforehand and fear Allah. And know that you are to meet him in the hereafter and give these good things to those who believe. Right here. That's what it teaches here in regard to it. It's not a mutual matter between the two. It's he can command and it has to be given. The tilt is the cultivated land according to Merriam-Webster. Okay? But we'll move on. But that's what's taught in the Quran. If you fear that, Surah 4:3, Yusuf Ali's translation, if you fear that ye shall not be able to deal justly with the orphans, right, marry women of your choice, 2 or 3 or 4. So polygamy is permissible. You can have up to 4 wives at one time. Divorce is very easy in Islam. All a man has to say is, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. Says it 3 times, it's divorce. All he has to say. But if you fear that you should not be able to deal justly with them, with your wives, then only one, or a captive. Now, if you've had a captive woman, you've raided and you captured some captive woman, she's free. You can have her all you want. Okay? That your right hands possess. So a captive that your right hands possess is a captive woman. That will be more suitable to prevent you from doing injustice. So right here, he says, if you got a captive woman, she's free. You can have her all you want. But you got to deal justly with your wife. Okay? But the captive woman, she's just free. Okay? So a captive woman, under strict Islam, if a man captures a woman on the street, captures her for a few hours, she's a captive woman. That's true. That's exactly what's taught. But look further. They can do what they will with a captive woman. That's going to the Quran. Yusuf Ali, Surah 4:3. Yusuf Ali's translation, Surah 33:49 says, O ye who believe, when you marry believing women and then divorce them before you have touched them, no period of iddah have you to count in respect to them. So give them a present, set them free in a handsome manner. So if you're going to marry someone, you don't come together with them, then go ahead and you can divorce them. Okay? And Allah, Surah 1672, they have what is now, there are two main sects of Islam, the Sunnah and the Shia, and the Sunni and the Shia. The Shiites are the smaller sect, and the nation of Iran is mostly Shiites or Shia, and probably about 60% of the people in Iraq are Shiites. So what we have here, the Shiites have what they call temporary marriages. Now the Sunnis don't practice this, although I've been informed that some of the Sunnis are beginning to practice. But we'll get into this as Mutah. It's practiced among the Shiites. And Allah has made of you mates and companions of your own nature, and made of you out of them sons and daughters and grandchildren, and provided for you sustenance of the best. If they then believe in vain things and be ungrateful of Allah's favors. They take this passage here and they interpret it. The Shiites do. Now the Sunnis don't generally interpret it this way, and they're the biggest sect. But the Shiites interpret this to mean a temporary marriage. You can just go together with a woman for a few hours, and it's a temporary marriage, and it's okay. That's all right. But that's the Shiites. Now the Sunnis object to this, so keep that in mind. Right? This is Shiites. Yusuf Ali in Surah 4:24, and he says, also prohibited are women already married, except those whom your right hands possess. So if you capture a non-Muslim woman and she's married, it's okay to have sex with her. Okay? That's what it's saying. Because you captured her. She's a captive woman. Except those whom your right hands possess. Thus hath Allah ordained prohibitions against you. Except for these, all others are lawful, provided you seek them in marriage with gifts from your property, desiring chastity, not lust. Seeing that you derive benefit from them, give them their dowers at least, as prescribed. But if, after a dower is prescribed, give mutually to vary it, there is no blame. So again, the Shiites interpret this to mean temporary marriages. You can marry a woman for a weekend, and then at the end of the weekend, I divorce you. It's over. That's exactly what's taught by the Shiites. Now, some of the Sunnis are starting to use this, and they use this argumentation. And but mostly Sunnis, as a rule, reject this temporary marriage. But right here, it shows pretty plainly here their view of marriage is different than the Bible view, but simply different. But look further. In Surah 4:24, goes on the next verse. Except for these, all others are lawful, provided you seek them in marriage with gifts from your property. So it's lawful, provided you're seeking them in marriage. That's all right. Desiring chastity, not lust, seeing that you derive benefit from them, give them their dowers at least. So pay them. So it would not be wrong to go to a prostitute under that you paid her. See? At least as prescribed. But if after dower is prescribed, agree mutually to vary it, there is no blame. So if you come to an agreement. Note that the dower is an agreed upon price. That would fit in with prostitution. Also prohibited are women already married, Yusuf Ali in 4:24, except those whom your right hands possess. Now that woman is a captive woman. Thus hath Allah ordained prohibition against it. So here he says, the captive woman, there's no regulations with you and her. Except for these, all others are lawful. See? Now, captive woman and captives and slaves. A slave woman is also like a captive woman. She's free. You don't have to marry her. You can have sex with her all you want. In Yusuf Ali's translation, 424, also prohibited are women already married except those whom your right hands possess. That would be a captive woman. And not to have sex with another Muslim's wife, but they could rape a captive married captive woman, or a slave. That's Islamic ethics with regard to women. I know you're not liking to hear this, but this is exactly what we're seeing. This is what's taught. This is what's practiced. Islam, captives and slaves. Slavery is a big thing among Muslims. It is widespread in the world. It is a growing thing in the world. And the Muslims are practicing. Yusuf Ali, in 424, he says, also prohibited women who are already married, except those whom your right hands possess. Now, I'll emphasize this, because that's your captive women and slaves. Let's look on. The believers must eventually win through. The Quran permits sex with slave girls. We go to slave girls now. The believers must eventually win through, Surah 23, 1 through 6. Those who humble themselves in their prayers, who avoid vain talk, who are active in deeds of charity, who abstain from sex, except those joined to them in the marriage bond, or the captives whom their right hands possess, for in their case they are free from blame. In the case of the captives, they're free from blame. So it's okay with them. And that would include slave women as well, because they're captives. And those, in Surah 70:29, and those who guard their chastity except with their wives and the captives whom their right hands possess, for then they are not to be blamed. This is another one of the surah. This is another one. It sounds like the other one, but it's saying the same thing more than once. It's not a mistake. It's there more than once. Note that the captives include captive women and slaves. What they captured in a battle, the women they captured are free game. Surah 3:14. Bear in the eyes, the Quran promises women for sex in paradise. Surah 3:14 through 15. Bear in the eyes of men is the love of things they covet, women and sons, that's what they covet, heaped up hoard. I don't say daughters, just sons, okay? Understand that's part of the view. Heaped up hoards of gold and silver. That's what you're going to get in paradise. Horses branded for blood and excellence, and wealth of cattle and well-tilled land. That's what you're going to get in paradise. Such are the possessions of this world's life, but in nearness to Allah is the best of those to return to. Now then, let's look at the next surah, the next verse, and Surah 3:15. Say, shall I give you glad tidings of things far better than those? For the righteous are gardens in the nearness to the Lord, and with rivers flowing beneath, therein is the eternal home. With companions pure and holy, and the good pleasure of Allah, for in Allah's sight are all his servants. Now, you're going to have companions. So in the paradise, you're going to be married. And you men, I was talking to men, and it never really explicitly promises women, to my knowledge, that they'll be in paradise. They'll get to be there as someone's wife. But right here, in Allah's sight are all his servants. Now, we're going to get some more here in just a minute. In Surah 56:10, Yusuf Ali's translation, and those foremost in faith will be foremost in the hereafter. Islam is a system of works. They don't believe that Jesus died for atoning our sins. They don't believe that the blood of Christ makes atonement for sin. You have a balance of good works. So if you balance out more good works than you have bad works, you get to go to paradise. That's a works system. Let's go back now. And those foremost in faith will be foremost in the hereafter, those do most good works. These will be the nearest to Allah. In gardens of bliss, that's where they're going to be with Allah, a number of people from those of old, and a few of those of later times. They will be on thrones encrusted with gold and precious stones, reclining on them, facing each other. Round about them will serve youths of perpetual freshness, with goblets, shining beakers, and cups filled with the clearing flow of fountains. Look at all this. It's all carnal. It's all having to do with the flesh. Verse 19. No after ache will they that receive therefore will they suffer intoxication. They're not going to be drunk. And with fruits any that they may select. And the flesh of fowls any that they may desire. So they can have whatever they want to eat. And there will be companions with beautiful, big, and luxurious, lustrous eyes, like unto pearls well guarded, a reward for the deeds of their past life. So they're going to have their companions. That's where they get all the 70 virgins or whatever they're supposed to get. That's where they get this, part of this. And from the hadith. Okay. Muhammad married, listen to this carefully. He married Aisha when she was 6 years old. Did you know that? And he consummated the marriage. Some sources, Islamic sources, say when she was 8. Others say when she was 9. I'm going to go with 9. Now, in the United States, you'd be in prison for that. But he is the pattern for Muslim men. It is practiced in Islam. Little girls are damaged and have surgery from having sex with a grown man, 6 and 7, 9-year-old girl. He is an example. This is an example for Muslim men. I say that's wrong. But that's exactly what we're dealing with. The Hadith has many other such examples for the Muslim man. I'm going to the Quran here, the Hadith now in the Quran. The Taliban in Afghanistan follow the Sharia, and the treatment of women is notorious. Woman with fingernail polish on had her fingers cut off. Okay? Women are beaten and stoned for not wearing a veil. Most Islamic countries treat women like the Taliban treat them. So women are treated very, very badly in these countries. The Wahhabi view of Islam, which is predominant in Saudi Arabia, follows the Quran and Hadith rigidly. This view is taught in the schools, in all the schools of Saudi Arabia. So it's taught. Muslims claim that Islam stopped the killing of girl babies in the Arabian Peninsula. If that's true, that's good. I applaud that. And if that was being done, and I think it may have been done, possible, then that's good that they did that. But they didn't go far enough. Islam gave women property rights. We applaud them for this. And so I definitely give them applause for that. But atheistic communism also stopped certain practices. Is atheistic communism right? They wouldn't agree with that, would they? Just by the fact that they stop some wicked practices doesn't mean that it's a good system. Doesn't mean it at all. Yes, killing girl babies should have been stopped. It's evil. Yes, women should have property rights. The Bible gave them property rights. But what we find is that that's not far enough. And that alone is not sufficient to say that it's a good system. Are women in Islamic countries better off because of Islam? If they are better off, then what? Well, better off than what they were, or better off than what they should be. Or are women in Islamic countries better off in spite of Islam? Okay. Right. Or are they not better off at all? Now, when we look at this lesson, I want you to be aware that what we're dealing with right here is we're trying to lay out what Islam actually teaches. And I think Muslims would have to agree with everything I've said here. I believe that this is a wrong view of women. It's the wrong view to take. And though the Bible does teach women are to be in subjection to men, it does teach that they're equal. They're equal to men. And that women are complementary to men. They have roles that are different than man's role. And I believe in the area where they have been given their role, that men are not to impede them and stop them. And I believe they have certain areas where they are to work and that's their role. And it's not a secondary role. And so we would have to study this more fully on the role of women. Of course, I've written a book on this. When you look at it, I would argue that Islam has the wrong view of women. That this is wrong, and that it should not be allowed to be propagated. Islam should not be. I hope that lesson has helped you to understand a little more about this. In order to become a Christian, you must obey God. And you have to contact the blood of Christ in order to be saved. We contact His blood by means of baptism in Romans 16. So we must hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. And we must obey God. We are subject to the Lord's invitation. At this time we not come as we stand and say.